Dear colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen, now we're starting the next session. I have to express my gratitude to Angel Turver, my dear friends and colleague, for chairing the important first session of our meeting. But now we are moving from a debate on Romanian achievements and European Union towards global stage. And myself, if you allow me, I will switch into Romanian in order to start our session dedicated to prospects for international trade relations of the European Union, the future of relations between the European Union and the United Kingdom in the context of Brexit. Stimați colegi, atunci când am decis...
Dear colleagues, when we decided upon this topic for our meeting today, we were in a different context. We had expected for the 29th of March to be the date of Brexit, and we expected that our session today would be dedicated to our relations with the UK post-Brexit. Well, still, the topic is extremely challenging and perhaps a bit controversial. I'm saying that because we do need international trade, but at the same time, there are a few issues to be solved. Some of them have to do with competence. According to the treaties, it is the Commission, the European Commission, to negotiate our international trade agreements. Or we know very well that the problems that occur when enforcing the treaties or implementing them also involve the national parliament. So we need to see how we split the competence and how we are involved in both the ratification of the treaties, but also in the process of their negotiation. I spoke a little earlier about the fact that we are in a controversial field. We have already started to debate the topic. It is about strengthening the multilateral institutions that we have, but we'll need to see how these international trade relations are shaped. We have been persuaded so far that free trade is the solution to everything. And many of the imbalances in the world of today is something blamed on free trade sometimes. So we need to be more involved, and today we have two special guests to my right, our colleague Lord John Lawrence Whitty, and to my left Mr. Luca Jaillet, the President of the European Economic and Social Committee. I will now give the floor to Lord Whitty to start. He is also the president of the EU Internal Market Subcommittee within the House of Lords, and I would like to invite him to share with us some of his rich experience, but also answer some of our questions on the Brexit process. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks to the Romanian Presidency for giving me this opportunity. I was here at the beginning of the Romanian Presidency when I apologised to them that the Romanian Presidency would mark the period when Britain left the EU. We're still here, and I think the last time I did say Britain would need more time and the negotiations would need more time. I'm afraid at the end of the day, the unpalatable truth is we still need more time. Let me just make another couple of regrets. First of all, that I am here rather than Lord Tim Boswell, who many of you will know has been a constant presence in the Cosac arrangements and played a major part in Cosac. He's sorry he cannot be here, and he remains committed to interparliamentary cooperation and British engagement with Cosac in one form or another in the future. I also slightly regret that we from the House of Lords are representing the UK at the moment, and there's nobody from the House of Commons here. Moreover, none of the delegates from the House of Lords are actually members of the governing Conservative Party. I say that because, not to say that it's not, therefore it's not our fault. It's more that what I say and what my colleagues may say is not necessarily what the future Conservative government may say in this context. Just a quick word about trade in general. For many years, free trade has been seen as the way of spreading prosperity around the world, but it has created some difficulties. And over recent years, there has been a setback to the failure of TTIP, the present situation between the United States and China, which I think is unlikely to be resolved at the G20 these next few days, and to some extent Brexit itself, as a reversal of progress towards free trade, and particularly free trade that is accompanied by standards, environmental standards, employment standards, standards of safety, and standards of human rights. Because unless you have the two together, then free trade does not bring all those benefits which theory would suggest. When the Brexit vote first occurred, many people who were Remainers like me were devastated, but nevertheless we thought we could work something out. We thought we could reach an agreement on the withdrawal, the divorce treaty, within a few months, and that by now we would be clearly into negotiations with a future and constructive trade arrangements and indeed security arrangements with the EU for the future. Now, that has not happened. Instead, after lengthy negotiations and the detailed withdrawal treaty agreed by the May government, it was put to the House of Commons 5 times, or put or withdrawn to the House of Commons 5 times and 5 times defeated. The UK will not accept the withdrawal treaty as it stands at the moment, or the House of Commons will not accept it, and I think it is unlikely that that will change if we change the Prime Minister, when we change the Prime Minister at the end of this month. Now, some of the objections to the withdrawal bill related to budget considerations, but most of them related to the Irish border. And I need to explain the importance of the Irish border in this respect. Clearly, for the future prosperity of Britain and of Ireland and the Anglo-Irish relationship and the peace process, a soft border, an open border, is necessary to survive Britain's exit. But it is difficult within the rules of both the EU and of international trade. And unfortunately, it has become a point of serious contention, partly because the solution that is in the withdrawal treaty is either that Northern Ireland continues to follow most of the regulated provisions of the European Union, and that would create division within the United Kingdom, or that the United Kingdom would, as a whole, be committed to remain within a customs union and regulatory alignment for an indefinite time. The result has been that the anti-European media and politicians have portrayed the European position as being an attempt to break up the United Kingdom or else to continue to have us chained to Brussels, even though the population voted the opposite. That is unfortunate political reality within the UK. There has to be some adjustment to this. It probably cannot be in the withdrawal treaty given the European position, but it needs to be in parallel to that. But it's all in this context of this session, it is important to recognise that those issues that arise from the Irish border are in a sense a proxy for people's views of the nature of a future trade arrangement between the UK and the EU. Are we going to be as close as possible? Something like Norway, possibly Norway plus, and that would itself resolve largely the Irish border, particularly if we were also within a customs union? Or are we going to have some significant but relatively limited divergence? Or are we going to go down the road of what many in Europe fear, which is Singapore-on-Thames, namely that Britain takes the road of a low-tax, low-regulation economy? I think, and I would like to say this, whatever government is in power in Britain, that last option is unlikely. No political party is committed to it, and the British public would not wear it. But the other two clearly are, and that, had the original timetable worked out, we would be negotiating the nature of that trade agreement now. But you have to realise that a row over the Irish border is in part a proxy for the discussions within, particularly the Conservative Party, about the future trade arrangements and trade arrangements more generally. I am not predicting who will be the leader of the Conservative Party and therefore Prime Minister on the 22nd of July. And particularly with one candidate, I'm not sure I can predict what would happen after that. But nevertheless, we will be in a situation where we can start looking at the process again. I suspect that it will be difficult to meet to reach an agreement with the EU by the 31st of October, given the relative stance of the likely incoming Conservative government and of the EU. I do think, however, a deal could be done. I think we probably have to focus on the wording of the political declaration, turn that more substantively into the basis for a proper free trade agreement, and there may be some warm words surrounding the withdrawal agreement, which takes the toxicity out of the Irish border issue. That is going to be difficult. It's going to require diplomacy and finesse, not only on the part of the United Kingdom, but also on part of the EU. And the EU will have itself to move a bit in order to resolve this in a way which is positive. The alternative of a no deal is damaging to all of us, to Britain, to Ireland, and to the whole of the EU. We should, between us, avoid that as far as possible. We can take steps to mitigate it, as we have, and as have the EU. But a no deal is no good for Britain, and it's no good for Europe. It is possible that a general election would be called. It is possible that we call a second referendum. But at this point, I would not be certain about the result of either. And therefore, whilst I might now be convinced we need a second referendum personally, I could not be certain to guarantee you what the result of that would be. So diplomacy between us needs now to take place following the establishment of a new government in Westminster. Thank you.
Thank you. Mulțumim foarte mult pentru prezentarea.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your very clear presentation. And now the President of the European Economic and Social Committee, Mr. Luca Jaillet, knowing that beside his expertise in the social field and in terms of cohesion, he has an excellent knowledge of international relations. So, Mr. Luca Jaillet.
Thank you so much, Madam Cretu, dear chairs, dear member of National Parliament, dear member of European Parliament, authorities, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first thank you for inviting me for the second time to your meetings. I firmly believe that Cosac has a very important role to play to reinforce the representative democracy. The European Economic and Social Committee that I chair is an important actor in terms of participative democracy. And as I believe that these two types of democracy are complementary, I am strongly convinced that our two bodies can only gain from regular exchanges. I think that today's topic is particularly interesting since the links between European trade policy to the issue of the relation between the EU and UK after the divorce, when the divorce will finally happen, which are since June 2016 extremely delicate, to say the least, in a very diplomatic way. I would like to start by saying that the European trade policy is one of our main success stories as European Union. The EU today is among the largest economic players in the world, accounting for over 16% of the world GDP. Its trade policy which is the projection of our internal market, the biggest one in the world, is effective and very dynamic. Effective because it allows to increase Europe's wealth. More than 36 million of EU workers depends on our ability to trade abroad and to spread also ideas and foster innovation to promote a sustainable economic growth. It's also very dynamic because European Union has concluded 39 trade agreements with no less than 69 countries in the world, exactly the double of what has been achieved by the US and China. For example, the last free trade agreement that has been entered into force between the European Union and Japan is the biggest ever and covers 30% of the world GDP. If we want to be pragmatic, this new alliance can drive and determine the economic and social agenda of the world for the year to come. We will also soon, as European Union, renew the Cotonou Agreement with Africa, a continent that will have soon more than 2 billion people and represent only today 3% of international trade, but has decided to create a free trade Africa that will build finally the largest internal market in the world, the African one. Yet more than 70% of the population of the African continent is under 35. And Africa has so an enormous economic strength and an exponential market potential in the years to come. So Europe is in the middle between Japan and Africa. And this being in the middle with this enormous capacity of dealing trade agreement and dealing international cooperation can make the difference. The European trade policy achievements are even more remarkable given the recent change in international relations. We have effectively moved from a cooperative international competitiveness to a very dangerous confrontation, even in between the Western partners. But most importantly, the EU trade policy is an extraordinary tool to promote the European economic, social, and environmental standards. In all its agreements, the EU now insists on the adoption of the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter. Once again, the recent agreement with Japan is a tremendous example in this sense. This chapter are key instrument in promoting our labor standard and even the Sustainable Development Agenda. The strategy adopted by the United Nations in 2015 fully embraced, at least in theory, by the European Union, and similarly, we now take advantage of trade as a means to promote the Paris Agreement on climate. The Sustainable Development Agenda, based on the 17 concrete Sustainable Development Goals, is in fact a strategy that perfectly balances economic prosperity, environmental issue, and social inclusiveness. This agenda, the 2030 Agenda, is clearly, for the European organized civil society, the way to go forward. The 2030 Agenda must be, for us, the overarching strategy of the EU for the next decade of the EU, and the EU must promote it also in the international front. What the European Union is already doing, and let me say, at least that as ESC, we would have expected much more courage on this point, Sustainable Development Agenda, in the strategic agenda just adopted by the head of state and government last Thursday night. The two last points I would like to make on international trade are, it is important for the EU first to continue to speak with one coherent voice all together, and the second, civil society matters. Even if the global economy seems to be going down, it is clear that international trade will remain more than important. Foreign trade was 43% of global GDP in 1995. Today is about 70% of the world GDP. And also we know that approximately 90% of the global economic growth in the next 10-15 years will be generated outside Europe. Therefore, only actors with adequate size and weight, as the European Union is, will be able to compete with giants such as China, US, and Russia, will be able to survive, let alone play a relevant role. I would like to remind here not only Mario Draghi, who said that these who promise just as going solo a new independence and sovereignty are not telling the truth, but also a brilliant economist and British philosopher of some century ago, John Locke, that we used to say that real sovereignty is not having the power to make law, but rather being able to control outcomes and respond to the fundamental needs of the people: peace, safety, and public good. And this we can only do if we are a real regional power, that if we continue to work together in a transparent and constructive manner. And for this, the role of civil society in trade relation, in trade negotiation, organized civil society and social partner is more than important. Involving this partner either in negotiation, either in implementation, and either in monitoring is of foremost importance. And fortunately, European Union has understood this and has placed in most of this negotiation a specific chapter that I will call a sort of societal chapter, where there are established bodies that involve on a regular basis civil society organization. Because only a full inclusion of this civil society and social and economic actor can ensure that trade and investment agreement will benefit all and hence gain broad endorsement and support. I will go now, last but not least, to the issue of Brexit, that I have no doubt to continue to define a lose-lose game, not to define a lose-lose tragedy or drama. If we now move to the relation between the EU and UK, I will first acknowledge the outstanding work of our chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, who has managed to keep united Europe in these 2 years and also to set the agenda with our British friends, arriving at the very end to reach an agreement that until now has been very much contested by some in UK, but without a real alternative. I have listened with great interest to the intervention of Lord Whitty, and I'm still not exactly sure what will happen next. Will UK really leave EU on the 31 of October? Who knows? Whatever happens, I fully agree this will be, in any case, a lose-lose perspective. From a trade perspective, leaving without a deal will cause huge damage to the British economy, as trade with the EU is hit by tariffs and other disruption. Trade tensions have already intensified and economic growth is set to stall in 2019. The main economic impact on Britain's June 2016 vote to leave the EU has been a sharp fall in business investment as executives become cautious over what Brexit will mean in practice. Whatever will be the exit, Brexit or Brexit, as I'm used to joke, the most is the raising level of uncertainty that will create enormous problems to company, to markets, to economy. As George Osborne, David Cameron Chancellor, famously said, Brexit is for the richest in our country. They can afford recession. Unfortunately, I would add, it is not Osborne, it's myself, it has been at large middle class and the poorest that have voted for leave, not the richest part of the country. It is, of course, difficult to predict now the detailed nature of political and trade relations between the EU and UK beyond October 2019. And it seems very clear to all of us that 3 years after the Cameron referendum, we are still in the middle of nowhere. For DC, one thing is more than sure. Regardless of the outcome of the Brexit process, regardless of what will happen on the 31 of October, be it during the transitional period, if any, or once the future relationship has been agreed, DSE is fully determined to consolidate and strengthen the ties and relationship built over the past 47 years with UK civil society. This is a fundamental engagement that I repeat here in front of you. As ESC, we fully endorse the paragraph 125 of the Political Declaration on the Future Relationship, which states that the parties, EU and UK, should encourage civil society dialogue. The ESC stands ready to do its part because we cannot and should not wipe out so quickly nearly half a century of common history, both politically and economically. With this in mind, the ESC intends to cooperate closely with the Commission so that provisions are included in the future agreement to provide for the setting up of a civil society joint consultative body. And personally, I would hope that a similar body has also to be established at the level of the parliaments. This would represent the most structural way and most effective way for organized civil society on both sides to jointly debate issues of common interest in all policy areas and to convey the joint recommendation to the parties in the future, and perhaps, I hope, to prepare a revision of this divorce in the future as soon as possible. Arundhati Bhattacharya, former chairman of the State Bank of India, said that Brexit is actually a step back in the sense that you are going back from being connected to being on your own. My hope is that civil society can provide the link to continue to stay connected between EU and UK after Brexit, and we can reinforce this connection as much as possible. And for this, I unfortunately will leave your session this afternoon because we will fly to Belfast to open exactly one of these cornerstones of this future relation with the Northern Ireland civil society, because this is perhaps in the middle of the different issue of criticity in UK, this is the most critical issue that even can reopen a civil war in Europe, and we can avoid this. So we will be there, not replacing the role of the negotiator, because we want not to replace this, but to tell to the churches, to the employers, to the trade unions, to the civil society actors, that we are there today and we are ready to stay there after the 31 of October to build up and to be close to what happened and to consolidate the peace process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually twice, once for your input today, second time for your contribution to the governmental conference on European semester last month. And I have to stress that Romania has prepared the 14 proposals for the situation of non-agreement, Brexit with non-agreement. We have too many colleagues willing to speak, 29. So our proposal is to keep 2 minutes, please. I say nothing, only giving the floor. The first, representing Switzerland, our colleague Hans-Peter Portman.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair, European friends and colleagues. Well, there is not only international commercial relationship between USA, EU, or between UK and EU, there is also a relationship between Switzerland and the EU. And as you maybe know, actually we are in negotiation or in talks for a framework agreement between the EU and Switzerland. And these talks are not on a good base since last week. We have escalation now. We have the EU who doesn't give to Swiss Stock Exchange anymore the possibility that EU intermediaries can trade there. Switzerland will do now the same next week. We're not going to allow to the EU intermediaries to trade anymore stocks and Swiss stocks in the EU. So there is starting now an escalation what none of us really wants, and it will produce only losers. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, you could say Switzerland is a small country, but please don't forget, Switzerland takes over its responsibility in Europe like none other of the countries, like you all, and Switzerland is not so small. There is daily more than a €1 billion trade volume between Switzerland and the EU. The EU profits of 40 billion trade surplus with Switzerland. And Switzerland is the second important trade partner to the EU, and with 980 billion euro, the second largest investor in the EU. The small Swiss population of only 8.5 million, ladies and gentlemen, is able to give 2.5 million jobs to the EU citizens in and outside of Switzerland. And the Swiss development projects are in 13 countries of the EU. As an example, here in Romania, Switzerland has projects in the healthcare system for children, or for example, Switzerland is training and organizing the Romanian Air Rescue Service. Swiss Parliament just announced it's willing to support southern EU countries with substantial amounts. We need, my colleagues, my friends, we need a respectful and sustainable bilateral relation between EU and Switzerland, and let me say to the end, with support of France, Germany, Italy, Austria, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Croatia, and a lot of other countries. They just have submitted a request for a supplement in the contribution of this Cosac meeting concerning the relationship with Switzerland and the EU. I hope you will support.
So thank you very much. And now I kindly ask to take the floor Peter Strobel from Federal Council, Germany.
Ja, Frau Vorsitzende.
Well, Madam Chair, dear colleagues, when we look to the future of the European Union, the development of international trade relations is something that's very important. Now, of course, we need to secure our economic prosperity. In the EU, around 31 million jobs are connected to exports. The effects of trade on social cohesion and political stability in Europe are also very obvious, therefore. When it comes to developing trade relations, there are some fundamental decisions that need to be taken. The EU has a values-based trade policy. We want competitiveness and a free market economy, and also we want to respect the rule of law and human dignity. Now, if you look at the United States, China, and the EU is the only actor which defends these values. Because unfortunately, the current US government focuses more on protectionism rather than free trade and multilateralism. And China is following its own political agenda. A few weeks ago, I was invited to Shanghai and spoke to the general manager of the Belt and Road project, the New Silk Road. And of course, it's impressive to see the sums that China is spending on infrastructure to promote its trade relations, but this isn't just about economic interests. The whole project has a decidedly political side to it too. So there are challenges also by way of populist protectionism on the one hand and authoritarian state capitalism on the other. And against that backdrop, the EU trade policies are very important for how globalism is going to take shape in the future. And it's against that backdrop that it's in the EU's interest to have a good relationship with the United Kingdom after Brexit. The UK was always a reliable voice for market economy and democracy in the world in the past, and this voice will be necessary in the future, and we hope to keep the UK on the EU side. So we therefore should not allow ourselves to be led by the chaos in the UK on the UK political scene. We should instead work closely with the UK for good trade relations and build a future of trade which reflects our values. Thank you.
Kindly ask you to keep 2 minutes. And now our colleague representing National Assembly in Slovenia, Andrej Reich.
Thank you very much for the floor. Tomorrow we are going to be celebrating 28th anniversary of our Declaration of Independence. At that point, we decided to leave a country where there was more and more populism and where the voice of the smaller nations was not heard, and where there was quite spread of damaging demagogies. This shows how afraid we should be of the spreading of right-wing populism. We have to make sure that the voice of everybody is heard. In order to address these challenges, Europe has to stand united when it comes to migration, when it comes to the aging of population, when it comes to relations with China, and when it comes to climate change. There are no simple answers here. When it comes to internal borders, when it comes to these challenges, we have to work differently. There is an ongoing threat that internal borders are going to become pre-Schengen borders as well. This happens on the Slovene-Austrian borders because there are more and more border checks there, and this makes the competitiveness of Slovene companies lesser and lesser. The queuing times are becoming longer, and this is damaging for our companies. This means that also the social security of a number of Slovene families is here jeopardized. And this is why we have to address Brexit by being really united, by focusing on external borders and leaving internal borders internal. At the same time, we have to make sure that the voice of everybody is heard, so that everybody is taken into account. This is why I would like to thank our British friends for their endeavours and their hope that the relations with the EU remains positive and friendly.
And now an important outgoing member of the presidential troika, Reinhold Lopatka from the National Council, Austria.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to give you a few thoughts on this important subject. First, Lord Whitty mentioned the setbacks of trade in the last years, which is really a pity. Hopefully, we will not face such setbacks in the upcoming years. We are living in a faster and faster growing competitive world. Therefore, it is important that the European Union, with its huge economic market, is self-confident in the future in regard to this position as a global player, especially in our relations with USA and China, as colleague Peter Strobel mentioned it already. In addition, we have to do and we have to focus on research and development, and we have to be at the forefront of digitalization again. Here we lost in the last years our leading position as I see it. Being an export-driven country, we have concerns regarding protectionism, which we do not only see in the USA, but also in other parts of the world. This causes insecurity, and eventually it could cost jobs at the end of the day. Speaking of international trade, we are pleased that we were able to have the CETA agreement with Canada. On the other hand, we were disappointed that we couldn't reach an agreement with the United States. Lord Whitty mentioned it, and also the speakers before, how important our agreement with Japan is, and hopefully the negotiations with Mercosur on the one hand and New Zealand and Australia on the other hand will be successful. It is my view that strong economic ties are also of importance when it comes to climate change, human rights and migration or cybercrime. So we have to do everything to be very close, and I want to finish with it, and as close as possible with UK. We must not forget that UK should remain one of our strongest relationships, trading partners and closest allies in all matters of security. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to our colleague Igor Peček from Slovenia.
Thank you for the floor. Good morning, everybody. On behalf of the Slovene delegation, I would like to emphasize what my colleague Reich has already mentioned. Slovenia is a country with a relatively small domestic market, and therefore the role of concerted international trade agreements at the EU level is of key importance. as was Slovenia's accession to the single market 15 years ago. International trade agreements open doors to new markets and business opportunities. Not only that, they considerably shorten administrative procedures and protect investments. This element was of importance in the past and remains important in ongoing negotiations. We all know that very well. And this is why the EU Affairs Committee within our National Assembly has paid particular attention to these aspects. Our misgivings were represented by the Slovene government in the European Council, as well as in the procedure related to the opinion 1/17 issued by the European Court. And this is why we remain convinced that the voice of national parliaments should always be heard. It is our task to actively follow current procedures on mixed agreements, as well as on the agreements in the exclusive powers of the European Union. Our engagement is a must and sends a clear message to our citizens. On Brexit, well, hopefully, the proposed solution, whichever that is, will ensure a stable and competitive business environment and as close a cooperation between the EU and the UK as possible for the benefit of us all. Thank you.
We thank you. The next speaker is our colleague, Professor Dr. Herbert Hirte, from Bundestag.
Frau Präsidentin.
Thank you, President. I'd like to begin by thanking everybody who worked on the exit or Brexit agreement, Mr. Barnier and the Commission, and all the people who have accompanied the process. We would have wanted a broader representation in the process. This is hard upon us, but we've got to prepare for the no-deal scenario. One of the business about Brexit is that you've got to protect the mutual trust. It's a quasi-legal concept. It underpins law in the UK and in Europe. We've got to protect the trust in the relationship. That should remain an anchor. Second thing, financial relations. One of the big problems at the beginning was how do you regulate financial relationships in the UK and the Union? I think, and people agree, that the Brexit agreement hasn't regulated the future yet. I think what will only work if it is fully negotiated later, and some of the aspects of the relationship will need to be conserved with the blessing of the Court of Justice. Now, there have been long discussions with TTIP and CETA. CETA took a long time. That should serve as a model for our negotiated relationship with the UK later, but it will take time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now a very interested person in Brexit, our Irish colleague, Terry Lydon.
Thank you, Madam President. It has been widely acknowledged that Ireland will be the European Union member state most affected by Brexit because of our close trade, economic and political ties with the United Kingdom. But of course, we are not alone in this. All member states will be impacted in one way or the other if and when the United Kingdom leaves the European Union. There are some industries already being affected by the uncertainty, such as agri-food, and others are anticipating potential shock to come. The Irish government has undertaken a lot of work to prepare for Brexit and has worked with stakeholders, including business groups, to make sure that they are prepared as well as can be expected in the circumstances. I wish to say that the solidarity of the other 26 members of the European Union with Ireland is very encouraging indeed. And on behalf of the Irish Government, I want to thank all the Member States for their support, including Romania as well. Just to say, the speech by Lord John Lawrence Whitty was very interesting indeed and very encouraging in the situation. The draft withdrawal agreement has been negotiated and endorsed by the European Council, and it's our position that it cannot really be renegotiated. We regret that the withdrawal agreement has not been ratified by the United Kingdom Parliament yet. We hope that there will be a way found through the current political impasse. I believe there is a solution there. I believe there should be possibly another extension applied for by the United Kingdom Government, because the time is too short for any solution to be reached before the new presidencies are appointed, the new Commission is appointed. They need time for the new Commission to be bedded in, to allow for some new imagination to come into this situation. Ireland represents about 1% of the population of the European Union, and yet it is the most affected. And surely within the European Union, we can see a solution that we would have a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom with the support of the European Union. Thank you.
We thank you, and we all hope in a solution. And now our Bulgarian colleague Imran Mehmedova would take the floor.
Thank you, President. Bulgaria supports the EU's work on its strategy for the adoption of new international trade rules in keeping with the realities of the 21st century within the WTO and on a bilateral basis. The Union's trade policy should guarantee mutual benefits for everyone within and outside Europe. It should be ambitious, and also the Union should protect itself against unfair practices from other countries. We hope that the exit agreement negotiated by Mr. Barnier's team and the transitional period have been the best achievable results given the circumstances, and it will allow both the consumers and business to adapt to the new realities after Brexit, with a possibility for a smooth transition to a future relationship that will be indeed as strong as it is now, or almost. The UK will continue as a strategic and a very close partner for the EU, and this is beyond any doubt, with or without Brexit. We need an ambitious arrangement for the future based on trade and security in the interest of both parties. The citizens' rights are a priority of utmost importance for us, Bulgaria, and they should be fully guaranteed after Brexit. We shall insist on ambitious freedoms of movement based on real reciprocity and non-discrimination among member states. And there should be some level of coordination in the area of social security and qualifications recognition. We protect the interests not only of our citizens in the UK, but also of UK citizens in the Union and Bulgaria. Thank you.
We thank you, and now I give the floor to our colleague Gerard Crowell from Irish Senate. Crowell.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I want to thank all the contributors and indeed all of the parliamentarians who have taken time to come to Ireland to look at our unique situation. Our border has been a question, and I'll deal with that in just a few moments. My colleague referred to the need for more time for the UK. I slightly disagree here. The constant stop-start is causing massive problems for particularly purchasers of raw materials in Ireland that are being purchased from the UK, or exporters who have to rent warehouses in order to warehouse goods and expecting we're going to hit the edge of the cliff, and then suddenly we're pulled back from the cliff again. And it is very, very destabilising for any economy to find that you're building inventory, losing inventory, and going through these constant cycles. The future relationship with the UK must be as it always has been. The Irish people have enjoyed travelling to the UK and working in the UK. Indeed, I went there to work when I was 15 years of age and was treated very well. However, That relationship must not, under any circumstances, compromise the European standards. It must not, under any circumstances, impede free travel. It must not, under any circumstances, result in a border at our ports in the Republic of Ireland. There has been some suggestion to get over the border problem that we would initiate some form of checks at our ports. The moment we do that, we place ourselves outside the European Union. So I would totally disagree with that. It cannot, under any circumstances, compromise the single market. The single market is most important to the European Union. I say that as a proud Irishman, but as a proud European as well. Ireland never had a hard border in its entire history, and this is something we must face up today. Ireland suffered from smuggling down through the generations from the time we became a republic. If we now reinstate some sort of border checks on our roads, those border checks will become militarised as they were in the past, and smuggling will start again. And all we need is one carcass of beef to find its way to the European capital that is not Irish beef, and it will destroy our market. The threat to the Good Friday Agreement, and most people here are probably sick hearing about the Good Friday Agreement, but let me tell you, the Good Friday Agreement is what is keeping both our states on the peace path at the moment. I met a mother only a couple of weeks ago, a mother in Northern Ireland, who had been given instructions to take her son to a crossroads to have his kneecaps shot off, because he stepped out of line with the terrorist groups. So let there be no doubt the terrorist groups are still there, and it would not take a whole lot to reactivate them. So we must be extremely careful as we move forward. The political system in Northern Ireland is broken and being exploited currently by the minority Conservative government in the UK. The political system is way out of step with civic society in Northern Ireland, and the civic society really want a solution that leaves them in Europe. Remember, every member of civic society in Northern Ireland is entitled to an Irish passport. I'm sorry I'm running over time. There's so much more I could say. I do know that we have the full backing of the European community. Can I just say finally, there can be no renegotiation of the deal. The deal is the deal. End of story.
Yeah, thank you very much. It is important for our understanding. For this reason, I allowed you to speak longer, but please keep, if you are able, to 2 minutes. I am inviting now our Liberal colleague from Netherlands, Anne Mulder.
Thank you, Madam President. I think it's important for us to have as good relations as we can with the United Kingdom, but I'm worried about two things. The first is, let's think that things go very well, economically speaking, with the United Kingdom. I'm worried then that some member states might say, well, it shouldn't go too well, because otherwise our country might also want to leave the European Union. On the other hand, if it goes badly with the UK, well, that's bad for the European Union as well, because then there's an important country in the EU which is becoming weaker. So I think we have the key to the solution. We need to make sure that we have good trade agreements, that we protect the single market for services and digital as well. I'm also worried about the UK. I'm concerned. One of the candidates for the Prime Minister in the UK has just had problems with his neighbour, and he has said that in the case of no deal, we could avoid tariffs, and that's complete nonsense. And we're just seeing unicorn thinking in the UK, and you can't reach a good agreement with that kind of thing. So I think that with the help of Lord Whitty, we're going to have to slaughter some unicorns. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now our Czech colleague, Andrej Benešík.
Děkuji za slovo, paní předsedkyně.
Thank you very much for the floor, Madam Chairman. The EU Affairs Committee of the Czech Chamber of Deputies has been very much part of the discussion on international trade agreements. We very much welcome these discussions. We monitor the negotiations and we discuss them at the national level, i.e. with the government and at the level of ministries. And we also communicate with the European Commission, and we also talk to our counterparts on the other part of the negotiating table. Recently, we have been in very intense communication with Mexico. But we have also talked about CETA and TTIP. What is very important is that these agreements need to also contain provisions that go beyond the framework of usual agreements, i.e. the enforceability of international law and also the stability and the rule of law. What is also extremely important is that we need to focus on the fight against social dumping and environmental dumping from third countries. And this goes hand in hand with the discussion on the climate change. The EU is not one of the major polluters. No, our rules are very strict. Our standards are very strict. And we also put a lot of pressure on our business partners, because some of our trading partners are major polluters, and so it is important for us as the EU as a whole to exert pressure there. I believe that the EU has a major role there, because making our own rules, which are already very strict, even stricter, does not really bring anything new. We need to make sure there is a change in countries such as China and India. The EU is very environmentally friendly, and we need to make sure that companies do not leave the EU for other countries which do not have such strict environmental standards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now from France, the Senate, Monsieur Jean Bizet.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, President, colleagues. The European Union is the biggest trade area in the world. It's its main strength. The European Commission has exclusive competence for this, and this is a strength as well. So together with China and the United States, the European Union is a big player. However, at the moment we are living through a crisis, and that crisis takes many forms. We're seeing unilateral decisions of an aggressive nature, and they have had an impact on trade, slowing down progress. There's a prospect of a trade war, and such a trade war would have a devastating effect on jobs and trade. There's also an institutional crisis. The WTO is in jeopardy. The WTO is a civilized way of laying down common rules and procedures and making sure that they're respected. And the European Union should remain committed to the WTO, together with other players such as Canada and Japan. We should continue to work with them on modernizing the WTO and on strengthening it with a view to the future. We also enter into bilateral trade agreements as the European Union. They're ambitious, they bring hope, and they're also a matter of some concern as well. National parliaments have to ratify them, and I think the European Commission could usefully improve the transparency of its negotiating process from the very beginning of the process. There has to be transparency, opening to parliaments, to business, to civil society. This is a challenge. It's the only way we can involve our citizens. Otherwise, people will be suspicious of institutions' intentions. As of November, we will start looking at future trade relations with the UK. The political declaration appended to the withdrawal agreement, which hasn't been agreed by Parliament yet, lays down the principles. But if there is no withdrawal agreement, what would any trade agreement actually include, especially if the United Kingdom were to decide not to respect its financial commitments and obligations? So that's an additional twist, an additional concern in a very unpredictable trade environment. And uncertainty is the worst thing when it comes to business. So I would support our Irish colleague, Gerard, I think we had to take a decision as a matter of urgency.
Bien. Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Angelos Votis from Cyprus.
Dear colleagues, undoubtedly, globalization has led to a great increase in trade, and this is an area where the EU has an important role to play as a major player through trade deals with third countries. In the context of these very complex trade deals, however, I believe that national parliaments, being elected bodies that are close to the EU citizens, so national parliaments have a role to play together with the European Parliament in an effort to ensure the involvement and participation of national parliaments to this procedure through constant dialogue with the European Commission, according to the Parliament's resolution of the 25th of October 2018. This can also happen through transparency, all through the negotiation process, to the benefit of European citizens, according to the Parliament's resolution of the 30th of May 2018. Please allow me, on behalf of the Cypriot delegation, there was a reference by the Turkish observer, a representative of a country that wants to join the EU family. There was a reference to bilateral, so-called bilateral problems with Cyprus that, in his view, should not be brought to the EU debate. Let me remind our colleague that EU obligations that refer to them, these are obligations of Turkey vis-à-vis the EU, and Turkey has not yet met with these commitments and obligations so far. This so-called bilateral problem refers to the occupation since 1974 of 40% of the territory of the Republic of Cyprus. This is against international law and decisions by the UN and the EU. The so-called bilateral problem refers to the illegal intervention by Turkey a few days ago by drilling in the exclusive economic zone. This goes against international law, and this resulted in a reaction by the EU. The EU is now preparing measures against Turkey if they do not stop this type of intervention immediately. If Turkey wants to join the EU family, they should respect international law and certainly every single member of this European family. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, our colleague Mark Angel from Luxembourg.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, I'd just like to share a few thoughts with you, thoughts from our Parliament on international trade. These thoughts are supported by the parliamentary majority and also by most of the opposition. In Luxembourg, we support efforts in the EU and the OECD to achieve a balanced, responsible trade policy, in particular in line with the 17 SDGs. I'd like to thank Luca Jayer, the President of the Economic and Social Committee, for underscoring the importance of Agenda 2030, which all countries signed up to in 2015. Luxembourg also supports initiatives at European level to strengthen businesses' civil responsibility and responsibility vis-à-vis the climate throughout the production chain. In 2015 and in 2016, we discussed a green card, and a number of parliaments supported that. We're also in favour of agreements to protect investments, and when it comes to dispute settlement, we would support the setting up of a multilateral court meeting the same criteria of independence as other international courts. And at European level, we'd also like to see an objective evaluation of economic agreements, bilateral agreements between the EU and ACP countries. Mr. Jayer did mention this in relation to the importance of the post-Cotonou agenda. When it comes to starting negotiations with the US with a view to achieving trade agreements, well, a mandate was given to the Commission in April 2019, and we're glad that certain guarantees are now in place. The European Union will only seek agreements that, with countries that have signed up to the Paris Agreement, and then we're also we also welcome the fact that guarantees in relation to agricultural products are also in place in relation to those discussions.
Thank you very much. And now we are coming back to Cyprus with Nikos Ketiros.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Dear colleagues, we need to keep in mind the fact that trade agreements that lack transparency include lots of risks. This shortcoming, in connection with a possible weakening and lack of responsibility from both sides, all these involve risks for labor rights, environmental protection and committing of environmental crimes, or perhaps fiscal fraud. I want to point out the fact that national parliaments, being closest to EU citizens, have an important role to play in this context, so that trade agreements will be more democratic as a result. I would like to refer to Brexit as well. The decision by the British to exit the EU is an unfortunate event that reflects citizens' disappointment with EU policies. These clear messages should be duly noted, and we need to work hard to ensure that the EU remains united, to ensure stability, peace, and prosperity for its people. Our colleague from the Turkish delegation made a reference here. They should not be upset by such references, because within the EU we are entitled to discussing and perhaps disagreeing in a democratic way without having to repeat elections when we're not happy with an election result, for instance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I kindly invite our new colleague, Anneli Ott, to take the floor from Estonia.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. So I would like to offer you the greetings of the Estonian delegation, and I would like to thank Romania for their efficient work and for fulfilling their goals as the presidency of the EU. So we support the priorities of the Romanian presidency. We need to contribute towards the cohesion of the European Union, and we also need to make sure that the trade relations will become stronger. For Estonia, it is very important that the trade relations between the EU and the United States will remain free of tensions. Also, the strong trade partners would need to cooperate in order to allow for the reform of the World Trade Organization. Estonia is a small country, and therefore we find it very important that we have clear rules when it comes to international trade. It is also important to look at the e-trade, because we need to update the rules for e-trade, and Estonia as a digital nation supports internet trading, so that for small enterprises would be able to enter the internet market and sell their products globally. Estonia supports common efforts when it comes to clear trading rules with the United Kingdom, and hopefully we'll have good cooperation also in the future. Thank you.
We thank you, and my apologies, Lord Teverson. It was not intentionally, so I give the floor with my apologies to Lord Robin Teverson.
Thank you, Chairman. No offence taken. The United Kingdom is still here. I wanted to respond very quickly to Mr. Benesik's comments this session on climate change, just to remind him that although we are a relatively clean economy, nearly all of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now that lasts for 100 years comes from Europe and North America, and China and India not yet. But I want to say also on Brexit that, just to remind colleagues, and I say this as a Liberal Democrat, there are millions of people in the UK that are determined to stop Brexit. And whether that will happen or not, we will see. But I want to really follow up some comments by Senator Bizet, particularly around the World Trade Organization and the international rule of law. This is under real threat at the moment, not just from President Trump and North America, but particular issues there. We, of course, have the WTO appellate body likely to come unable to function from December this year, when 2 members are up for re-election and will probably not be appointed by the United States. We've seen also in North America how the NAFTA agreement has been torn up and been renegotiated without a real proper consultation with everybody, and further threats even then to Mexico. On the law of the sea, the United Nations law of the sea, we've seen in the South China Sea with China trying to impose the 9-dot line and territorial integrity around its artificial islands. We also have from America, again, from the Trump presidency, the weakening of NATO, something which is important particularly to the United Kingdom and I'm sure France and other members, but particularly to our friends in Eastern Europe. All of these are a challenge to the world order at the moment, and why it is so important that the world's largest economic bloc stands up for the rule of law and the international institutions that we have at the moment, and that is, I see, one of the European Union's greatest roles.
Thank you very much. We have still 13 speakers and 4 minutes. So I kindly ask you how to proceed. If somebody is willing to give up now and to speak in the next session, because all of us will be here together in order to deal with important topics, we could take 10 minutes from our lunch break. So, how to proceed? For instance, I would give the floor to the next speaker, and meanwhile, perhaps you would decide. The next speaker being from Sweden, our colleague Björn Wichel.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you to our Romanian colleagues for a good presidency and for hosting us and for interesting presentations. On Brexit and future trade, the EU's position on the Brexit question and our relations with the UK is very clear indeed. But we're still waiting for the UK to tell the EU what they want, and we should wait for the UK's answer before we discuss any new position on our side. But regardless of what happens, it's important for us to have good, close relations with the UK. The EU will do well if the UK does well, and vice versa. But having said that, in order for us all to reap the benefits of the European Union, we need to take our responsibility and do our duty as well. And if you're in the single market, you cannot at the same time compete with each other. We shouldn't have any sort of cherry picking going on. So on trade agreements, we're in favor of there being good, ambitious trade agreements, because robust trade agreements are a good way to achieve economic development and to create conditions where we guarantee good labour conditions, where we can protect social standards and work against climate change and have a better environment. It's very important for us to combine development with a good distribution of prosperity. Competition should be based on innovation, and we shouldn't have a race to the bottom and low wages and low standards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our compromise proposal is everybody 1 minute and being free to intervene in the afternoon session if willing to say more. It's good? 1 minute, please. The next speaker is Lord Charles Knight-Null.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and a cut-down version, but I wanted to return, if I may, apart from saying that I support strongly every word that Lord Whitty said, my colleague, in his unicorn-free speech, to World Trade Organization reform. There's a general business principle that if you're, as an entity, moving less fast than the world outside, you will become extinct, just as a dinosaur. The current crisis is an appellant body crisis. There are constitutionally meant to be 7 members. The US, starting with the Obama administration, has refused appointments and reappointments. We now only have 3 members of that, and you need 3 to try a case. And in December this year, we will have 1. The ministerial conference is not due until June next year, and the issues are to the powers, the process, and the timing of that body. If we can't work together as the United Kingdom and the EU to try and solve this, there really will be major international trade problems, and this is something we must do whether Brexit takes place or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And the next speaker is Mr. Martin Kinnunen from Sweden.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear colleagues, as a representative for a country which is dependent on exports, Sweden, I don't need to emphasize how important it is for us to break down trade barriers. So for Sweden, the ability to enter into trade agreements and to protect the single market is very important for us. So there are very successful trade agreements we've reached with Canada and Japan, and it's not just about getting rid of tariffs, it's also about non-tariff barriers, which we've had to get rid of as well. Now, those agreements can serve as good examples for future trade agreements. There are still many challenges remaining. We need to look at industrial trade with the United States, and also we need to have a good China policy that's effective because at the moment trade policy from China is quite threatening, and we need to have a common front against it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madame Liliana Tanguy, Assemblée nationale de la France.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you, President, colleagues. The existing trade scenario at the moment is characterized by conflict with the US and possible trade wars. The US has agreed to suspend the imposition of certain tariffs in order to find a compromise. Now, when it comes to negotiations with the Americans, the start of those negotiations is basically a formality or a theoretical process, because the prospects are not good. It's going to be a very hard and difficult process, and we need to stand firm when it comes to President Trump's plans for duties. Sustainable development and the effect of trade policy on the environment are very important issues for France, and we have made a number of proposals at European level, and those will be enshrined in our forthcoming CETA plan, which will be discussed in Parliament. And we also had other proposals which we presented back in February 2018. Moving closer to home and European markets aren't really integrated. The Balkan markets are a political and commercial challenge, and we're not present enough as parliamentarians. And that's why a lot of French MPs would like to suggests the conclusion of the Berlin process in order to have an inter-parliamentary agreement. This initiative has been supported by a number of MPs from a number of member states, and I would urge you to spread the word amongst your colleagues and encourage them to sign up, because that will hopefully allow us to involve citizens and their representatives in the Berlin process at all levels, in the Balkans in particular, and in particular in relation to economic and commercial policy, with a view to ensuring stability.
And now, Monsieur le député Pierre-Henri Dumont from...
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chairman. Before we talk about future trade relations with the UK, we need to answer a preliminary question. Can we trust our future partner? One of the candidates for Prime Minister has raised questions about the UK not paying the withdrawal bill, and that might undermine future trust in the UK as partners. When it comes to negotiations on a future relationship, all preliminary elements have to be fulfilled first. For example, in terms of rights of citizens, looking ahead to a future relationship, could I just draw your attention to a couple of points? First of all, in practical terms, we need to ensure the flow of trade between the EU and the UK, and any procedures should take account of technological progress, so that we can ensure that goods that do not meet our strict standards do not enter the European Union. And we need to make sure that transport means remain competitive. And we also need to make sure that there's no internal competition between the channel ports in different EU member states. We don't want ports to be pitted against each other to gain market share. And then there's the question of migration as well. We can't allow traffickers to abuse asylum seekers by promising to help them across the channel.
Thank you very much. And now, representing Chamber of Deputies in Italy, Marina Berlingueri.
Yes, thank you. Many thanks for a session on trade policy, including social pillar. Trade policy agreements are important for exporting goods and services. The rule of Europe is crucial, not only for Europe, but for the whole world. Negotiating good trade rules is a good thing for workers, social inclusion, R&D, equal opportunities, pensions, combating climate change, and other subjects. The social dimension of the economy is a challenge we need to face. If we don't do it together, we parliamentarians, then who else is going to do it? We should work in two areas. We should reinforce the social pillar. We're putting more resources in. The social pillar should become central in trade agreement negotiations. A cohesive, strong Europe with one voice in these areas will be able to punch at least to its weight in international negotiations, and this will stress our unity.
Now, our colleague Domagoj Hajdukovic from Croatia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Even though it's impossible to predict how Brexit will end up, I want to turn your attention to one question that was not mentioned today, apart from our colleague from Bulgaria. The question of labor force. It's a question which has an impact on trade, on the economy. A large number of British citizens live within the EU, and also EU citizens live in the UK. Their destiny, their status are still unclear. And since this is an extremely large number of people making up a large labor force, we need to keep this in mind. There is even a group, British in Europe, of 35,000 Brits living in Europe, and they assess that 3 million British citizens are now living in EU member states. A large number of our citizens also now live in the UK. Whatever happens with Brexit, we need to keep this in mind. This situation, this issue needs to be tackled. Our friends are unfortunately leaving the EU, but some others are hoping to join the EU. Let's not forget the Western Balkan, especially Northern Macedonia and Albania. Thank you.
We thank you. And now, 1 minute intervention coming from Bastian von Apeldoorn, Netherlands.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. In the draft contribution, we read that Cosac encourages the European Commission to pursue and negotiate free trade relations with countries and regions basically around the world. But I would like to ask the colleagues and panelists to also consider that increasingly there's a growing awareness of the unequal benefits of globalization and environmental and social costs of free trade. And in the context of a populist backlash against globalization, we are now confronted with Trump's protectionism, trade wars, as well as the challenge of Brexit. And the question is whether in response to all of these destabilizing developments, we should move full steam ahead with yet more free trade agreements. Next to the social and environmental costs of unrestrained globalization and free trade, there are also concerns about transparency and democracy. So in my view, the way forward for any future trade agreements is to address these issues head-on, which would require, amongst others, that the European Commission conducts fully transparent public consultations before providing a mandate for negotiation. So the principles of transparency and democratic accountability should also apply to EU trade agreements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have still 4 speakers and the lunch waiting for us. Now, Bernard Darkan from...
Thank you very much, Madam President. I will try to do in 1 minute what my colleague took 4 minutes to do, but we won't hold that against him. I would like to agree with him in one sense. I do not think continued delay is of any help at all in the negotiations that are taking place. All it does, it drags the indecision on into the future in a way that's damaging to both the UK, the European Union and Ireland in particular. In relation to the Good Friday Agreement, which is referred to again and again and again, I want to say this. The Good Friday Agreement was an agreement entered into by Britain and Ireland and the United States and the European Union. And it was a solemn agreement we believed was going to be kept. And somebody else mentioned already that what will the UK do in the future given the expressions of some of the contestants? And I would worry about that, because if we enter into a solemn agreement, we expect it to be kept. And I hope that that will apply to all sides in the future. We have kept it. But the most important thing, and I finish with this, is this. The raison d'etre for the war, the guerrilla war that took place for 30 years in Ireland was the removal of the border.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to our colleague Vitalino Canas from Assembleia da República, Portugal.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. The UK's exit from the European Union is still impossible to explain, bearing in mind the challenges that we all face at the moment. But if that is inevitable, then we need to remain united here. We need to remain united when it comes to the Irish border solution. We were there recently, and we saw how important it was to ensure that there is no physical border. So we need to stand firm and support our friends in Ireland in particular. I'd like to underscore the importance of trade agreements with Japan, Canada, agreements that are already signed and up and running. And it's also important to finalize the agreements with Mercosur. Mercosur are countries that share many cultural, political and historical values with Europe, so we need to conclude that as soon as possible.
And now Mr. Martin Klus from Slovakia. No? In this case,
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. I will use the luxury to speak in my native language as far as we have a short time. Takže ďakujem veľmi pekne za...
So thank you very much for the floor, and I would at least in this way like to thank on behalf of the Slovak delegation to the Romanian presidency for great organization in this respect. Also, as concerns Brexit, on behalf of the Slovak Parliament, I would like to appreciate the unity of the EU 27, which we have managed to achieve. I personally, as well as the majority of citizens in Slovakia, would welcome Britain, the UK, staying in our community. Unfortunately, the developments in the Conservative Party are pointing to the worst case scenario, that is the scenario of a hard Brexit, and in this respect we have to get ready for serious trouble and problems related to international trade and prospective worsening of our relations with UK friends, and also possible splintering of the UK itself, which many have drawn attention to in the past already. So, very simple question, if I may. Is the European Union today ready to offer an immediate response to our Scottish friends or friends from Northern Ireland who are forced to leave the EU today against their will if they decide to go their own way, either economically or socially? Thank you.
Thank you. And now the last speakers for this session, Mr. Igor Spimenov from Latvia, our colleague.
Good afternoon. I'm going to speak in the Latvian language. Es runāšu latviski.
I'll be speaking Latvian. I want to briefly touch upon agreements on investments. These are closely related to trade agreements. This may sound a bit skeptical or critical, but nevertheless, my wish is to highlight the importance of balance between the interests of the EU and its member states, thereby putting a brake on populism. Opening up markets always brings short-term benefits, but we have to consider long-term consequences as well, in the sense of our competitiveness. Therefore, our approach should be more organized towards long-term development and benefit, not short-term gains. We should strive towards improving the skills and capabilities of our citizens and not replacing them with foreign products. We have to have a strong national component in defending our interests with our foreign partners. Member states should think and remember about their competitiveness when approaching foreign partners in the format of trade negotiations. Thank you.
Very much I have to deal with chairing the meeting because our speaker, Mr. Jaye, has to leave. I would give him 1 minute for a comment or two, and Lord Whitty is with us, and if he is so kind, I could invite him at the beginning of the next session to comment more on different aspects related to Brexit. Yeah? So,
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Je serai...
Thank you very much. I'll be very brief because at 2:30 I've got to be at the airport. Just one comment on Brexit. I think one important word was used. We cannot destroy trust in this relationship, but the basis for trust is very simple. Pacta sunt servanda. Everything we've done up to now, if all of that's going to be junked, then it's going to be very difficult to reach agreements in the future, because you can't just throw away our history. We need an agreement for citizens' rights, for trade, for security, and also to continue on our path with the UK. Secondly, on trade, I just wanted to say one very simple thing. It's not just about continuing to guarantee the good work that the European Union has done up to now and defending our interests, which of course are fundamental, but also we need to understand that the next step what the next step in international trade is. I recently had a dinner with the Chinese ambassador in Brussels last Thursday before a roundtable with China, which I'm going to be co-chairing in Shanghai in 2 weeks' time. And for the Chinese, multilateralism is the priority. The question is, and I'm very happy that that's the priority for them, the question is that whether we in Europe want just to leave the torch over to the Chinese to defend multilateralism, or whether we too want to defend multilateralism with the Chinese, defending social values, democracy, the social aspect of trade, and all of those things which we hold dear. That means that Europe really needs to strongly speak out in favor of reforming the WTO and defending multilateralism. We can't wait because the Chinese are going to move quickly. It's crucial for them to enlarge their economic and trade power. So Europe has a major challenge ahead, a major role to play, not just to protect its own interests. Thank you.
Tout à fait d'accord. Now I have to thank you very much for your interventions. We shall start after the lunch with the answer of our dear invited guest, Mr. Lord Whitty. I have to thank our interpreters for the first half a day dealing with our with the interpretation of our interventions. And now, my dear colleague invites all of you for the lunch. You have to follow our staff, and we meet all together here at 2:30, 14:30. Thank you very much.